Alright, folks, here's what you've been waiting for. It's time for Imagination Land. We're going to imaginary numbers. Alright, so to start off this lesson, the bottom line is, first thing to know about, is that the imaginary unit here, okay, is defined as, okay, so is defined as I. What the imaginary unit is I. We're going to use that letter. And basically, all that is the square root of a negative sign. Of course, we put a number with that, so -1. Because there's no number you can take the square root of in the real world to get that. So, imaginary number, okay, is a number whose square is negative. So I'm just going to write down whose square is negative. Okay, and imaginary numbers, okay, occur when a quadratic has no roots has no roots in the set of real numbers. So no roots in the set of real numbers. Everything you've learned about so far, sorry, going to be real numbers, tough to write. You first learned all your counting numbers, and then your whole numbers we added 0. Then we added integers, so you had the negatives. Then we added rationals, where we threw in all your decimals and fractions. Then we came up with the irrationals, which threw in your square roots that were not perfect squares. And all that stuff made every number you've ever learned, which is called the real numbers, okay, including pi and all that. Now we are going into where you have the negative of a square root, and that's going to be the imaginary land. So those are imaginary numbers, okay? So a pure imaginary number can be written in the form of bi, b with the imaginary, the b part, okay? And basically that's where the b is a real number, okay? And the I is the imaginary. Make it look a little more like that. Also known as the square root of -1. So, let's start looking at these problems here. If I take the square root of -36, let's break that up. That's the square root of 36 times the square root of -1. Well, what is the square root of 36? That's a 6. And we just said that the square root of -1 here is I. So your answer is 6i. Same thing if you look at the next one, number 2. I got 2 times, we're going to break up square root of 49 into, or -49, the square root of 49 times a square root of a -1. So I get a 2 times a 7 times an I. So your answer, 14i. Nice and easy. Third one, -3 times, now I got to break up the square root of 10. The square root of 10 is square root of 2 times square root of 5 times an I, or square root of -1 right now. Call it an I in a second. None of these, this one doesn't bust up, this one doesn't bust up. So guess what? 10 doesn't bust up, does it? So the -3 out front stays there. The square root of -1 comes out as an I, and the radical 10 goes back together to 2 and 5. Last one here on this page, number 5, let's see, 4 here. Got 5 times square root of -1 times, and I would bust up 8 as square root of 4 and a square root of 2. And of course, the 5 is still out in front. And the square root of 4 here, this is equal to a 2 comes out. This is going to come out obviously as an I. And the radical 2 over here is not going anywhere, is it? So what's the 5 out in front here times the 2 that's coming out? 10. I. Radical 2 is still under the house. Okay? And that's how we're going to do it. All right, let's keep moving on. All right, so we're off and rolling here. So basically, negative square root of 25 is this. Gotta grab it here, wrong. Grab a pen instead of moving everything around. Take the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. We know the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of negative 1 now is called I. So there's your answer, 5I. Take the next one in number 2. Take the square root of 32. You guys can bust up 16 whatever way you want into tons of 2's and look for the buddies, or we know it is 16 times 2. And then times, don't forget that negative sign, so that's negative square root of 1. Square root of negative 1. So square root of 16 is a 4, comes out. The square root of negative 1 is an I, comes out. And the 2 can't come out, has no buddies. So that's going to stay that way. 4I, radical 2. Number 3, I got a negative 3 already out in front. We're going to bust up the square root of negative 50, and I'm going to do it as 25 times 2. And of course the square root of negative 1 for the negative sign. This comes out as a 5. This is going to come out as an I. So you get negative 15, because don't forget to multiply those two together, and an I. And the only person still in the house under the radical sign is 2. Then we got one fraction. Scares you guys to death half the time. So anytime you see that fraction, big deal. It's negative 2/3 times, let's bust this thing up. Negative square root of 36 is square root of 36 times the square root of a negative 1. We know that comes out as a negative 2/3 times a 6 and an I. Don't forget, 6 is really 6 over 1. I love to cross reduce. 3 goes into there twice. So negative 2 times 2 is negative 4 and an I. And that's your answer. That's all you got to leave. No big deal. Pretty easy. Got some more here. I'm going to start speeding along a little bit now. A little bit more on this. Once again, I will bust this up. Square root of negative 1 is the square root of negative 1. Square root of 81 is already a perfect square, so let's put it on the radical. And so is x to the 6, if you remember. So what comes out? The 81 is a 9. Okay. The square root of negative 1 is an I. And remember, if it's an even exponent underneath the radical, just cut it in half. You're dividing by 2. So this is going to be x to the 3rd power. And that's your answer. Everybody came out. Nothing left under the radical. Then we get to number 6. Don't forget, you got the square root of negative 8 over the square root of 9. You can bust them up that way. And we know that 8 is really 2 times 4. So the square root of 4 is going to come out as a 2. The negative sign is going to come out as an I. But the 2 is still going to be under the radical. And in the bottom, the square root of 9 is 3. Can't reduce any more than that. Same thing here in number 7. You're going to get the square root of 25 times the square root of 1. If I take it the longer way, just the negative 1, sorry, just to show you the longer way, all over the square root of 121. Pretty straightforward. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of negative 1 is the I. And the bottom is a nice 11, and we are done. Number 8, a little different creature here. We take the square root of negative 2 on the top, square root of 7 in the bottom. If you remember, we cannot, 7 doesn't come out, so we can't leave a radical in the denominator, so we are going to have to multiply by the square root of 7. Coming back to you from 2 chapters ago. When I do that, I actually get the square root, let's see here, 14 in the top, which I can't bust up. They're both prime numbers, so that's going to stay there. But the negative sign right here can come out. So you've got I radical 14. And yes, 14 is 2 and 7, but nothing comes out. In the bottom, I got a pair of buddies. That's either the square root of 49 or it's just 7. And you got your answer. So these are pretty easy overall. Just remember all the tricks.